Hello everyone, welcome back. I have another video for you today, one on nubs on columns. And we have seen this before in one of my older videos. I'm going to provide that link in the description so you guys can check that one out. But I found two more sites that has this phenomenon. Now, up until now, we can say that it was just maybe a quirky coincidence that there's two sites that have nubs on columns. But now that we're at four sites with nubs on columns, I think this might be a repeating hallmark that we can trace. And to me, now all unfluted columns at ancient sites are suspect. And I want to look very close and go back through some old photos. I challenge all of you guys, all of you other researchers, to look through all of the old photos, your photos, photos on the internet, see if you can find any more instances of nubs on columns. I think there might be something more to this. So the two sites we're going to look at today are Hosn Suleiman in Syria and the Temple of Adonis in Fakra, Lebanon. So these sites aren't actually very close to each other. They're in the same region, but they're not like they're in the same state or the same country. We have Jordan, we have Armenia, and now we have Syria and Lebanon. And while we're here, I'd like to point out something from Syria nearby in the vein of nubs. How about this structure? Nubs on the roof. Now, when you see this, I cannot entertain that these are for lifting. These are obviously some kind of decoration. Now, the distribution is somewhat uniform. You can tell how they've had to put some single nubs on blocks and double nubs on blocks to get the spacing right. So this is obviously a decorative technique here. But then other instances up here at the top, see where it's kind of missing a few? Something happened there, or that is part of the design maybe? I'm not 100% sure on why the layout is the way it is, but in this configuration, I think we're talking about a decorative motif here. And what does this imply? Looking at some of the other nubs, some of them don't look very decorative in their placement, and we're going to look at some of those types of examples today. But I've been talking about this with Rob over at History Maze, and I think, like the square holes, this is more than just one, this has more than just one purpose. This is an entire system. Like the square holes were for lifting and attaching, perhaps. These are also for lifting and then maybe for also decoration and other types of things. So first we're going to look at Hosn Suleiman in Syria, and there are not that many photos of either of these two sites today, and I've tried to pool as many as I can, and I've tried to put them in a narrative order to help us understand the sites. So we're going to try to go through these in a somewhat orderly fashion. First, you can see that there is a central temple and then a perimeter wall around it with gates. And not only does the central temple have the nubs on it, like we're going to see, but part of the gate does as well. So it's not just isolated to the temple, but this whole complex seems to be contemporaneous and connected in construction style. First, we're going to look at the temple, and we're going to go around it in a counterclockwise fashion. So some of these photos look better than others, but we're going to try to point out all the interesting instances of hallmarks and processing marks and all kinds of things. Lots of stuff going on with this temple. So first, this is the front. You can see the stairs, lots of rubble. You can get an idea of how big it was. It has these columns that are also part of the wall. We'll call them facade columns or a column facade. So the walls and the columns are made of the same blocks. Okay, we're going around to the right, and first of all, right away, what do you guys see here in the foreground? I see a decorative piece with a stair-step motif on it. How about that? We know the stair-step motif is a connected hallmark, goes all around the world, so to see it here, I'm not surprised. Looking at the upper structure, I wanted to point out here, square filler stone, small filler stone at a corner, that's a hallmark. And as you zoom in, you can see that the blocks have margin lines, bevel lines on them. So I'm going to call this structure a bevel block structure. Ooh, possible square indentation there. Okay, we're walking around to the right some more. You can see some of the damage to the lower foundation here. You can see that it does flare out like the Temple of Garni does. Interesting connection there. And you can see that this column facade continues around the back and the other side. And it is this corner over here on the right. I'm sure you can see it already. This is kind of a grainy photo, but you can see it. There's a big nub sticking off on that segment. And if you search the Wikipedia for Hosn Suleiman, this is the photo that they give you for this part of the temple. This is the best photo you're going to find of this corner. I can't find any better photos of this exact corner. So we will see better photos from other angles that show them, but it's really unfortunate that I can't find a better photo from this angle because this is perfect. It shows that not only is there the large one up here, but there's another one down here and perhaps some other ones as well. And it's very interesting to me that only this column has them. None of the others seem to have them. I've looked very closely at all the other photos, you guys can too, and see if you can see any remnants of where one might have been knocked off, but I can't seem to see any. Of course, we're missing a lot of columns, so perhaps there were some on the missing columns, but as far as the ones that are left intact, it's only this column on the back right of the temple. Here we're walking around the corner some more, and you can see that there's a lower doorway. That's interesting. And then again, this column, you can see nub there, a nub there, and one down here. And in the next photo, we'll see even better quality. This one's a little better. See them? Maybe even two on this one segment. That's interesting, right? I don't see any more on any of the other sections. None. Interesting Ionic capital on the column. And this is probably the best quality photo of this side of the temple that I could find. You can see them clearly on the left, but nowhere else do you see any nubs. Why is that? If they're just for a lifting aid, shouldn't they be on every single segment like they were in Jerash, Jordan at the Oval Plaza? That seems the most pragmatic execution or placement of nubs. But then sites like Garni and here, it's very random. Why is it just on this isolated column? And just like on the other side, you can see the margins on the blocks. These are clearly bevel blocks, some very prominent ones over here. And you can see how the margin lines continue across where the column facade is. And on the right where it's pulled away, you can see the secret to how these stayed standing. The blocks for the walls are the same blocks for the columns. So it anchors the column into the structure. It's a bit poor quality photo here from that same angle, but just a better view of the subterranean little doorway here, lower level doorway. I'm not sure where that goes to. I couldn't find any photos. And now let's look at the gates, because the gates around this perimeter wall are just as impressive. And in one of my older bevel block episodes, I mentioned a portion of this wall, and I didn't make the connection for the rest of the site. But now we can see it in more of a holistic view. I found a lot more photos of this wall. So first of all, you can see the margin lines. These are bevel blocks. Not all of them have them, of course. Some of them larger than others. The course arrangement is going to be interesting. And trapezoidal gates with very lavish decoration and embellishments in size motif. This is the other side of that gate. There's a large step. You see square hole there. Maybe there's another one on the other side where a step was attached. So there was a set of stairs perhaps. And then you can see other little square holes. Maybe that was for a latch for something, a gate or a piece of ornamentation. Really fine work at the top. You can see that there are a pair of angels and then I think the remnants of some kind of filigree or ornamentation here. Maybe an inscription perhaps. I think on some of the other gates there are inscriptions. This is one of the side gates. This one heavily damaged. You can see there was a window over here on the left. It's no longer there. Perhaps there was a matching one on the right. You can see there was obviously a larger doorway coinciding here next to this, corresponding with this smaller door. Why the two doors next to each other? Interesting. Is this like the royalty door? And then this is the plebeian peasant everyday door. Interesting. Again, a square space at a corner, and then lots of little square holes, perhaps for ornamentation or gating, and then a mainstream researcher here in the foreground. Here's the other side gate, and this one I found really interesting because if you've been watching my videos, you know about the lipped blocks, the blocks with the cusp of material. Well, what do you see here and here and around here? Again, what does this imply? The bevels and these little cusps of material. Are we talking geopolymer or some kind of stone processing method here? And again, trapezoidal doorway. Even here, maybe this, look how much this oozed out. It's very interesting. Was that an accident? And of course, look at the course arrangement. Some very large blocks, but not exactly a uniform standardized distribution. And then of course the texturing on these blocks and the way the square hole is in that reminds me a lot of Baalbek. There's a lot of construction elements here that remind me of Baalbek. Even the gate design, reminiscent of Baalbek. Now here's a smaller satellite temple. I couldn't really place where this one was in relation to the rest of the site, but there is some interesting things going on in this little temple here. We'll go to the next photo. This doorway, this gateway, look at the perforated holes in the incised motif. Very interesting. What is that about? I've seen this before, and I've seen it, I believe, in Petra and in some other facades around this area, but also I think in India, in some of the caves. Those facades have these perforated holes in some of their gate incised motifs. Is that for some kind of inlay, decoration, metal of some kind perhaps? I think that's a possibility. Could it also have been for an extra architectural element that went, like for stone perhaps, that went in here and was attached with pegs, small pegs? Also a possibility, I think. Some of the spaces I want to point out, like this one over here on the right, I think this is intentional. You see that it's got a pretty good connection up here at the top, even though the corner's cracked. So I don't think any of this structure has shifted. I think some of these spaces might be relieving spaces for, shock absorption for catastrophes. I'm not sure, or maybe just an accident and they didn't get the block entirely right. But there are these little gaps, so I'm not sure what to think about those. I don't think that's necessarily shifting because the rest of the structure is still, pretty straight and all the motif lines still line up. So what's going on with that? And also you'll notice that the motif and the block for the wall, it has this nice transition from rough right into the smooth, finely carved motif. And back to the walls, this was the portion that I showed early on in the series, and this is probably the most impressive portion of the wall that's left. Now you can see what's going on with the course arrangement. Why are these huge blocks on top? Of course it anchors the wall very well, but that's a very hard way to construct a wall. You can see the angles of all the blocks, how some of them are polygonal, and then of course other little square indentations and holes in the blocks. Here's a large square hole at a corner. Probably had a filler stone in there at one point, perhaps, or maybe some other kind of attachment, and then maybe remnants of others broken off, perhaps. But of course, you see the little square holes. And we're going to look at another photo here, black and white, that shows you where these are, a better contrast. And then the stark bevel lines as well, where the margins are a lot finer and the surfaces are scratched, top and bottom. All these blocks seem to have a scratched surface texture to them, and then the margin lines are very fine. And I also want to point out the foliage while we're here. Just this large bush growing in this portion. We'll go to the next photo. And you can see how big it gets during the summer. That must be a big void in there for such a large plant to grow. Of course, we see foliage growing in the little small square holes and things, but there must be a big void in there to support such a large root system for a plant like this. So what could be going on inside of that block? Maybe there's some spaces or voids or square holes inside of it. And then here's that corner of the same wall. You can see the polygonal block down here below. Large block, anchors the whole corner together, locks the whole thing together. And then the square hole here, and then some of this interesting maybe protrusions and waviness on some of the blocks. Okay, now let's look at one of the main gates. Now this is very, very interesting to me. Now, do you guys see it already? Of course you do. 3 nubs on these blocks, and then perhaps, I'm not sure what this could be. This could be just a lip of material. It could be a crack. It could be a serpent motif. I'm not sure. We'll look at other photos. But very interesting that these 2 blocks, this block has 2 nubs, this block has 1 nub. I'm looking for a corresponding set. I don't see them. And matter of fact, I don't see any other nubs. And I don't think I saw any nubs in those other walls. Did you? So what's going on with this section and why the nubs here? Is this some kind of decoration? Is this some kind of code or symbolism of some kind? Not sure. So this is the classic triple gate motif, trapezoidal door, incised motif. We have, I believe this is called the fan light. Shout out to Ziggy Dan. Am I saying that right? This architectural motif of the void above the doorway to relieve the weight off the lintel, keep it from collapsing even when it's cracked like this. So we normally see this in one of 2 executions, either this semicircular design or the triangular design. That motif goes all over the world, and it comes in lots of different executions with arch pieces and keystones, of course, but also maybe with just a couple simple blocks with cutouts in them. So some varying styles, but the motif behind the styles is the same. And interesting that these corner pieces, they also are these column facade motifs, and the capitals on them, very ornate, almost Corinthian style. And maybe you guys are looking at the 2 niches here, niches, next to the main doorway. You see these little square holes peppered throughout it. Let's look at some more photos and see what we can gather from those. So here we're a little closer, and you can see a person for scale. And I'm still not quite sure what I'm seeing over on the left. Is this just simply a crack, or is this maybe some kind of low relief carving? And if that's what it is it a serpent? It's eerily familiar to me in the vein of nubbed blocks, because South America, of course, Peru, Silistani, there are blocks with nubs that also have small, low relief serpent motifs on them, serpent images. So if that's what this is, that's very, very interesting, of course. But you can also see over here on the other side, there are these weird kind of indentations. It kind of makes a semicircular shape. And then over here on the right, this one kind of does it too. So I'm not quite sure what we're looking at there. Is that just like kind of an imprint of something? Is that a raised motif? Why the nubs there, of course? Lots of questions. And then looking closer, you can see some more of these little square holes. Now their arrangement's going to be very, very curious when we look at some closer photos. It doesn't look like decoration was attached to these. I mean, we can propose that, but let's look at some closer photos of these and see what they are. So here's the back side of that same gate, and look at all the little square holes above the niches. Were these for some kind of attachment of decorative elements, like metal ornamentation? That's the only thing I can think of. It's very, very odd, but it also kind of extends over into the headers of these lintels here on both sides. I'm not sure. That very well could have been some kind of decoration. I'm not sure what to think about all these little holes. It seems to be isolated to just these 2 areas. And this photo is a little shaky, but even still you can see there are margin lines. There are interesting things like small filler stones, and then angled blocks, multi-angled blocks, maybe square indentations, and then this large rectangular indentation. And you can see smaller ones with more square indentations as well. Interesting stuff. And I think that might even be a small filler stone at a corner right there. Very interesting. So here's a close-up of the left-hand portion of that wall. You can see the person for scale. You can kind of get an idea of some of the margin lines there, the one I was talking about earlier up at the top. And then, of course, the square holes on the right. Perhaps this is a secondary stair set here. I'm not sure. Of course, you can see all the broken elements. There were columns here at one point. And here's the best photo I could find, straight through the front of the front gate, looking at the temple in the background. And you can see that these niches have all kinds of little square holes around them. What is that about? It even kind of ruins the incised motifs and the decoration already on the blocks. So I really don't know what to think about these. Why are these here? Were these for little offerings by later people? Was there a decoration, a facade intended to go over this? Some kind of embellishment? I really don't know. It's very strange. And even the way that the header seems to be almost pressed into blocks, that's very interesting. It's almost like it's molded. So here's the best close-up photo I could find of one of those niches. And you can see that these little square indentations, they really kind of ruin the artwork. It goes right over some of this nicely carved decorative motifs. I don't see what else this could have been for, except for a embellishment of some kind of fixture that went on top of this. This is very strange stuff, guys. I've never seen this before. And I would like to point out the niche has what's called a clamshell motif in it. And if you guys watch Chuck over at CFApp's channel, which you better, his recent video on Sogmatar, he talks about a region there that has a rock cut element, and that rock cut element is a niche with the same clamshell motif. And I'll show pictures of that in just a second. This is really interesting. This is a close-up under one of the trapezoidal gates, and of course you can see this inscription. I'm not sure what to think about that, if it's original or later. It is really well done. It's pretty straight. It's pretty even though it does look a little bit skewed to the left side a little bit. You can see this corner versus this corner. The inscription is a little off of center. Just thought I'd point that out. But a very interesting eagle motif, and I think two figures with central eagle. Very interesting. I'm not sure what to think about that. I want to say that's original and probably pretty protected under there. It also looks a bit defaced maybe, or slightly eroded, not sure, but very interesting motif. And does the eagle have something in its talons? Very interesting. I'd like to see a better photo, but this is the only one I could find. And then the site also has some lion imagery as well. And I believe that this is a crack in the block. So this is damage, but it may be a seam. If it is a seam, it's very interesting that they did the artwork at a seam. But I'm 90% sure that this is a crack. And then here at the end, real quick, just that image at Sogmatar that Chuck was talking about. You can see the figure, and behind him is this clamshell motif in the arch and the niche, and that is the exact same as this. Very interesting connected motif there. And of course, I'm sure if you are familiar with classic Greek and Roman architecture, that this becomes the classical motif in their architecture, but how far back does this motif go? That's my question. So, some interesting architectural anomalies at Hosn Suleiman, and some familiar hallmarks and motifs as well. And now we're going to hop over to Fakra in Lebanon, and we're going to look at the Adonis temple. But there are also some outlying structures that have some more familiar motifs and hallmarks. So let's look at the temple first. I'm really surprised. I've never heard of this temple before or seen it before. It's very unique. Now, we're going to see a lot of Greco-Roman styling, but the way that it's been incorporated into this very eroded bedrock, that's a very unique execution. And we're going to see more photos of this. So here's some of that terrain. Very interesting formations. Heavily eroded, and I'm going to have to assume that the interesting appearance is why they chose to put their temple here amongst them. Here's a really cool view from above, and you can see how they literally carved back these formations to make part of the walls of the structure, and their walls go right up to and incorporate into these bedrock elements. So now I'm going to take you on the path of discovery that I took when I was first looking at this site, and how I came across the nub on the column. And I'm going to challenge all of you to look for more of them. I looked really hard, and I think only one column at this site has nubs on it. And in this instance, it's only one segment of one column that has nubs on it. So as we go around the structure, we get a little closer, and you can see an interesting foundation, two different colors, and interesting coarse arrangement, very slender blocks here, right? And how it kind of undulates. It's not perfectly flat. Of course, there's a lot of settling. We have to account for that. And with the colors, notice that there's a more of a brownish block in conjunction with this other grayish block. And the gray blocks, I have to assume, came from some of these formations, but the brown blocks maybe came from somewhere else or were made a different way. And I want to look very close over here. What do we see right away? Aha, a bevel block. So the brown blocks are bevel blocks, or made by the bevel block people. Here's one, and we're going to see some more instances of them as well as other traditional familiar hallmarks to us, like slender filler stones and other maybe protruding blocks here. Maybe that's a nub on a block or just a protrusion on a block. Square holes at corners again, and more of that as we go on. And this isn't the best photo, the lighting's not so good, but this is the right-hand portion. We're at the entrance. This is the front wall, the right-hand side of it. See more of the formation over here on the far right. But I just want to point out in this photo, this column facade. This is another motif that links back to Sogmetar, and we're going to look at that toward the end. So keep this in mind, that there is another type of facade colonnade at this site. Here's a pretty prominent bevel block down here in the bottom. Here's the left-hand portion. We were over on the right, now we're moving over to the left. And you can see there were more columns here in the past, so there was a front portico or porch on this temple in the past. You can also see more of the column facade and more of the bevel blocks. They start popping out, and more of the hallmarks, the square holes at corners. So I knew I was looking at a connected site to some of the other sites we look at least in the construction techniques. And I didn't know at this point that there were nubs on column segments, but now that we know, look at some of these other ones. Do you see any other nubs on any of the column segments? I think there might be one on this lower column segment here, perhaps, but there is a style of connection that we're going to see later on, and I'm not sure if I'm going to call that a nub or some other kind of protrusion. It's hard to explain. I'll have to show it to you. Now the site has been heavily repaired. There's all kinds of patch pieces and cemented pieces on the columns and the other structure. And we're also going to see a lot of wires, like metal, sticking out. And when we look at that, that's, I'm assuming, rebar and other reinforcing in modern times. So here we're standing in front, looking forward into the temple, and you can see some of that metal that I was talking about sticking out. I have to assume that's rebar and reinforcing. And at first, you don't see anything interesting, just plain columns. But we're going to walk through this gate and we're going to start seeing some interesting things on these two flanking sections of columns. Now this was the first photo I saw. I know it's a horrible grainy photo, but even in this quality I knew I was looking at something strange. Now this column segment right away, it has some kind of protrusion on it that's supporting the beam above over to the column. I thought that was strange, and then I started looking over and I saw right on the left hand corner, I saw a nub, and I wasn't sure if that was just a trick of the photo, so I wanted to dig deeper, but I was 90% sure when I saw this that we were looking at another spot with a nub on a column. And you can see across we have that similar execution, this protrusion of material off of the column that acts as a seat for laying the block above. And here's another good photo, a little crazy fisheye angle, but you can see what I'm talking about. This material, how it acts as a little anchor, a little seat for the lintel above to sit on. And there's a different kind of configuration over here. I'm not sure what's going on, if this is it looks like it's some kind of ornamentation, but it's really hard to find a photo that shows this. We'll look more in other photos, but I'm not exactly sure. But the execution is different from left to right. I find that interesting. It's not a mirror image. Something else is going on here. But in this photo, I was 100% sure there is a nub on this column segment over here on the left. And perhaps we're looking at some other square indentations in some of the blocks too. That might be what we're looking at. And luckily there are actually a lot of photos of these columns, and I've looked through all of them to see if I can see any more instances of these little nubs like this. I have not seen any other photos, any other columns at the site that have these little nubs that don't appear to do anything. They might be for lifting, but they remind me a lot of the ones at Jerash, Jordan. Very small nubs on column segments. Now we're going to go through a lot of photos that have similar angles, but I just want to prove to you guys as best I can that I did not find any other nubs. We'll go around to the other side, and there's going to be a corresponding nub on the other side. I'm going to say approximately opposite this one. But other than that, in this whole temple, and even in a smaller temple nearby, I did not find any other nubs like these. So what does that imply? That it's only on this one column. Here's the other side of that same section, and this is kind of grainy, and there's better quality photos coming up, but there you can see the corresponding nub on the opposite side. It's very interesting. That does seem like a execution for lifting. If you were going to lift the column segment with tackle, you would have nubs on the opposite side to even the load on a central piece of rope above. But why aren't there any other nubs on any of the other columns for the same process? If it was the process, it would have to have been repeated across all of the column segments. And I don't see instances of them broken off either. I know we see a lot of damaged columns, but the ones that are remaining, if this was the standard technique, they should be on at least the upper half of all the column segments, correct? How else would you explain that? Here's a good quality, nice contrasted photo. See that nub? It's only on that segment. If it was a standardized practice to use that for lifting, none of the other ones have it. I see a weird indentation there, some kind of indentation. But where's all the other nubs if that is what that was for? Now decoration, again, wouldn't there be more of them? Why only on this one lone column segment? Another closer good contrast photo. Still don't see any others. I do see more bevel blocks in the background though. The margins start popping out with good contrast lighting. A close-up of that weird protrusion on that segment used to hold up those pieces. That's just very interesting way to do that. A little bit closer, you can see both of them. It's not distorted. You can see there's something going on over here. This looks more like a cut instead of like this, more molded and rounded. This looks more angular, and there's something here in between the lintel piece and that little seat. It's some kind of statuary perhaps? I'm not sure what that is. Again, it's really hard to find photos of that. And here's the rest of that section on the right. I really don't know what that is. It looks like some kind of statuary filler piece, but I don't know what it could be. Maybe it's an owl or a bird or something. I'm not sure. That's just guesses. But you don't see any other nubs in any of these other segments. And these columns are only made up of a couple segments, where other ones are made up of many segments. That's interesting. Perhaps that's a square hole in one segment. And then, of course, look in the background. I'll zoom in. Bevel blocks with square holes in them. Very interesting. And then, of course, look how it is incorporated into the bedrock. And now we're in the far right corner, looking down the colonnade. I don't see any more nubs. And this column on the end is actually square. How about that? Maybe this is restacked. You know, this is a heavily destroyed site, so we have to assume there's a lot of looting and reconfiguring going on here. But for what's left, there should be more instances of these nubs, I think. Again, you can see this element I'm talking about. I'm not sure what that is. You know, I really can't find a good quality photo to figure out what that is. Some kind of filler piece, though, of some kind. New or ancient, I'm not sure. And these are the only other columns of that style and material that are still standing. And I know bad lighting, but I don't see any other instances of nubs. Of course, there's broken off pieces, but I don't see any. Very interesting. And then of course the columns in the background, different material. I don't see any nubs on those. And here's looking from inside the temple back towards the front where we were. A lot of rubble, so heavily destroyed site. A nice angle of the incorporated bedrock. Very interesting how they did that. It's very curious as to why they would choose to do it that way, but a way of attaching their structure to the Mother Earth. Very symbolic, right? And then there's also this little temple structure nearby. Now, the attribution on most of the photos said Byzantine church. I'm not sure if that's true. I'm assuming that this is contemporary with the other temple. The columns could have been taken and placed here from that temple, recycled, reincorporated, and some of these blocks could be restacked. That is a possibility. I'm open to that. But the fitment in some of these blocks is still very good, and it is indicative of a primary site. There is a lot of rubble, but these columns, they are the exact same as the ones from the temple, so I have to assume that the columns are from the same time period. And I tried to find a lot of photos of these columns as well to see if we can see any more instances of nubs. I could not find any. I do see some damage in some of the segments, so perhaps we're missing some, but on what's remaining I don't see any. And I really looked hard. I tried to find as many angles, regardless of the quality. I tried to find as many angles as possible to see if I see any, but I don't. One thing that makes me think that this is an original configuration, an original site, is over here we have a small filler stone at a corner, and I think that that is indicative of primary site here. Another angle of the columns, I'm still not seeing any nubs on any sections. I do see some damages though, so perhaps there were some. Again, I still do not see any. Bevel block wall in the background, very tightly fitted, does look original. Then just a couple more final angles just to prove I have not seen any. And again, small filler stones, so I'm thinking these walls are original and the columns were placed here originally. Multiple segments, and then the bevel block wall in the background. Prominent bevels here. So we'll close it up today by looking at some of these smaller outlying structures. Now these are the ones that first drew me to the site. You can see some more of the strange bedrock, eroded bedrock in the background. And it was this altar in particular that I found very interesting. Before we look at that, let's look at this small shrine in the front here. First of all, the Lebanese think it is important enough to put on their money. That's pretty interesting. I like that. This upper course of blocks is interesting. It has that reverse bevel block style to it. The columns are interesting. They're very plain, unadorned. It almost looks like they just left them in a stage of development. They didn't finish them off, especially when you look above at the incised motif. That's a little more decorative. So it's a strange juxtaposition. From this angle, you can see the lower blocks are a different style and perhaps another. Is this a serpent motif or is this just a lip of material? Hard to say. It's kind of obscured by the grass. I don't know if I found any better photos, but just interesting little anomaly on the block. Very eroded on top, heavily weathered or damaged. The inside as well, very cracked and damaged. Another angle, different lighting. You can see some of them are darker, others are lighter. More of that bedrock in the background. And what I find interesting is the coping stones on the top. You notice how they flare out That is very interesting to me. That reminds me of Egyptian architecture. A lot of the top of their temples have this same coping piece that flares out. And just like we saw at Huanaco Pampa in Peru, that also has a platform with these same coping stones that flare out. I think that is a connected motif. Now let's look at the altar. This thing is amazing. I am fascinated by this thing. So, what do you guys see right away? You see the protrusions on some of the blocks. Very interesting the way these are bevel blocks. That's they look just like the other ones we see. And the way the margins are irregular, very interesting. This one over here though is a little bit more precise. I have lots of photos of this, and luckily there are some really good high quality photos. And just look at the design. It is trapezoidal. It has the flared base. It has the flaring coping stones and the interesting border trim. That reminds me of Qasr el Sagha in Egypt, has this same motif. And then above, we'll see better photos, there's a stair-step motif, just like at Hosn Suleiman and Petra and Palmyra and all kinds of sites. Of course, there is a lot of repair cement here and then down here. So keep in mind that this is a restored structure, but it looks like the original configuration to me. Maybe a square hole in the corner there. Great photo. You see the bevels and the margins. They're interesting. They're kind of rounded. Not sure how to explain that. And again, why do some of them have them, others don't? Some of the margins look a little more precise. Less defined though. The protrusions on some of the blocks. Is this art? Like Shermanator Osborne, shout out to Shermanator. He's always telling me to look for low relief art. Could some of this stuff be low relief art? Heavily eroded perhaps? And then again, now we can start seeing the stair step motif around the top. Now you see some more decorative elements down here below and some more rubble. How much taller was this in the past? Was this some kind of tower? Or maybe a base for an obelisk or something similar? Something to think about. Here's a nice lighting on this corner. You can see how it has the corner bevel line, like a lot of our sites do. And more of these bevel blocks down below. They're in the entire structure. Some do not have them, yes, agreed. But how else do we explain the tight fitment? I'm not sure. I have to say that this is original. I know that some of these blocks are different colors, but there are also bevel blocks in these colors, these lighter colors, grayer colors, and the browner stone. Interesting course arrangement again. Notice that, the slender stones, and then this huge slab on top. And I've tried to capture all sides of it. It's hard to find all angles of this structure, but I don't believe there are any openings in it. I believe it's solid all the way around. Here's that side we were looking at earlier with the thin stones and then the wide, we'll say one wide stone and then more square stones. Just interesting course arrangements throughout the whole structures like that. And then a nice close-up. You can see the coping stones are the way the flare is and the rounded part, it's all one piece. Each block has the entire motif carved into it. And then hard to find photos from above, but it looks to be solid. I don't see any void in the middle, so it looks to be a solid stone structure. And then we'll move on to this. This is the third structure nearby, and this is called the Tower of Claudius. And obviously there's a lot of rubble here, so this structure was obviously a lot taller. But was it a tower, and did it belong to Claudius? I don't know. You can see a person there for scale. Very large opening. It's a very plain structure, has a little bit of ornamentation around the doorway. We'll see more of that. For the most part, very plain structure. Same bevel blocks. I'm not sure if there's a bedrock core that it's carved out of. It looks to be entirely blocks, but perhaps there's a bedrock core. Rob at History Maze, are we looking at another kiln perhaps? I'm not sure. I do like that theory, and I like to keep that in mind, looking at some of these structures. A stairwell here, that is interesting. If it was a kiln, Would they have a stairwell, or would this be more of a platform if this was industrial? I'm not sure. It seems more like maybe a secondary stair set. Smaller stones, yes, compared to the other building elements, but again, perhaps an original stairway. Can't say that for sure. You'd have to remove all this and see if there's any other stairs underneath. Lots of rubble here, of course. A little bit closer, you can see the people for scale. And yes, the stairs are smaller blocks. Perhaps they are recycled blocks, secondary, but maybe they are original. You see there's a lot of rubble on top of them as well. This angle you can see very interesting voids in the walls. This lower one here, these two here, this one up here, that appears to be intentional to me. I'm not sure what purpose. Venting, perhaps, if we're going by Rob's theory. Perhaps these are for attaching. There was a lintel, a cornice, a coping here, and they attached into these sockets. Something to think about. But then, of course, a heavily eroded doorway. You see very banged up, beat up, and the corners have really been rounded off. And then a last look here in the winter. Got to remember these sites, some of them, they do get snowed on, rained on, weathered. That's why we see a lot of the cracking we see. Maybe there's a slight gap above this lintel. So again, we might be looking at that connected hallmark, the keystone piece with the two sides, creating a small void to relieve pressure off of the lintel. But again, sometimes it's very highly decorative, sometimes it's purely functional, and maybe they only needed a very small void to achieve what they wanted. Obviously, it's still standing, even though it's heavily cracked. Maybe you guys see the inscription down here in the far right. Is that the way they would decorate a structure like this originally? Leave their name on it in the corner. Is this a secondary inscription? Is this where we're getting the name Claudius from? I'm not sure. But it is interesting that there is a little bit of, I'm going to call this graffiti on the structure. And I could only find one photo of the inside, and I assume this is where it is because it came up with all the other photos, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm sure there's more to this. There's a slit here in the back, a window, arrow slit perhaps. I'm not sure. Is this a stairwell that continued up? Is this how you get to the top of it? I didn't see any opening in the previous photos. We can go back and look again. Perhaps there's an opening up here, but I didn't see any other overhead photos to be sure. So did this tower continue in the past? There's definitely something more to this than what is left. But what configuration was it? I'm not sure. I don't see many circular column segments, anything decorative. All this rubble looks very chunky and industrial almost, not very decorative. I don't see any cornice elements or incising on any of the blocks, very plain blocks. So what was the original intention of the structure? What was the original level of decoration on the structure? And finally, I just want to jump back over to Sogmatar and remind you guys to go watch Chuck's video on Sogmatar. Very interesting that some of the architecture here and at Haran nearby does seem to match some of our other sites. Here, I wanted to point out these round structures. I believe there's at least a couple of these, and they have this facade of columns going around it. So just like we saw at the Adonis temple, this motif. So how far back does this motif go? Where does it originate from? We do see a little bit of incising on some of these blocks. The coping stones flare out. Even in the bottom they flare out. So connected architectural hallmarks that go a lot farther than we are told they go. And to whom are they originally attributed? I really wonder. Is this put on top of something older? Was this the original configuration? Rob, are we looking at kilns again? I mean, some very interesting ideas, guys. I'm not 100% sure on any of these concepts, but all I'm looking at is the physical evidence, and I'm making the connections through the architecture. I like to look at physical evidence first, and then try to connect stories to the physical evidence, because most people do it the other way around, which is fine. But if you don't know the sites that you're talking about physically, then how can we proceed from there? And then just a little bonus round for you guys. Swaby and Sanliurfa, Turkey. Now Sanliurfa, Ur, these areas around Göbekli Tepe. And Swaby, if you listen to Dan Carlin's podcast, Hardcore History, you hear him talk about the Swaby as an ancient people. Well, let's just look at some of these sites around this area. Swaby, I see some familiar stuff already. The chunky style of arches, heavily weathered blocks, but some of these blocks look very familiar to me. I see some incising on some of them, especially on the lintels, right? The way the blocks fit together, very interesting. Some larger blocks and then smaller courses. I believe these are trapezoidal doorways below, and then some interesting spaces in some blocks, maybe some square holes at corners, right? Some interesting hallmarks maybe. And then looking close, is some of this stuff low relief art again? Heavily eroded artwork on, I mean, that looks like a little gecko or a lizard or something. I'm not sure. You guys tell me some of this stuff. Is there art on some of these blocks in low relief? And does that look like some of the art on some of the Göbekli Tepe stones and in Peru, perhaps? I'd like to talk about that with you guys in the comments. Some other heavily destroyed structures, I'm assuming the same site or nearby. The same flared coping piece again. Interesting. And what's going on with the weathering on the blocks, the discoloration? Is this indicative of a fire or something even worse? Very interesting the way that it's weathered. Perhaps there's some repurposing, recycling of elements going on. You see the incised motif on this one over here. Very nice. But it's kind of starkly different in terms of level of weathering than the rest. Maybe there's some more of it down here. This does look kind of weathered. Is this a coping piece along with some of these other pieces around here? I believe so. So a lot more to this structure, maybe even above these coping stones. Interesting, these might even be lipped blocks. They have lips of material perhaps. So there's a lot of interesting architecture around this area. Man, what's going on with the discoloration here? The way it's eroding, is that what we're going to say? Is it eroding? Is there art on some of these blocks again? I'm not sure. Maybe some of it's just weathering, but I think in some instances we might be seeing art. So we'll wrap it up here. Pretty much more of the same, different angles. And then maybe perhaps even some subterranean elements. That's very interesting. Look at that, rock cut elements. So let me know what you guys think of some of these artifacts and some of this architecture around Turkey and the other sites we looked at today. And what does it mean now that we have 4 sites with nubs on columns? So thank you guys for hanging out with me, and we will talk to you next time.